is a record crowd. You never had a crowd this big. That's an honor.
Guess who's coming for a visit? Donald Trump will be in Canada this week for the G7 leaders meeting, along with some people he's crossed swords with, like Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky. Already a potentially tense get-together, and add to it fresh conflict between Israel and Iran. I'm Catherine Cullen, and this week on The House, the first sit-down with the new Foreign Affairs Minister. How does Canada view the new hostilities between Israel and Iran? How close are we to a deal with Trump to end tariffs? We'll also talk to a veteran of this big international meeting about how Mark Carney should manage the tensions around the president. Plus, is Mark Carney a conservative?
There's aspects of what Prime Minister Carney's done so far that I think some conservatives are very happy to see.
That's former Conservative leader Erin O'Toole. We've got him and two of Parliament Hill's sharpest political observers on Carney's views, the shifting public mood, and where it all leaves Peter Boehm. But first, Trump's last G7 visit to Canada ended with angry tweets. Can this one stay on track? The House is now in session. On Sunday, world leaders will start to arrive in Kananaskis, Alberta for the G7 summit. And they will do it at an intense time, a reignited conflict between Israel and Iran, the clamor from countries around the world to get the U.S. to lower tariffs, and the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Add to that questions about the guest list, and Mark Carney has a lot to manage as chair of the G7. So, what will Canada do? Anita Anand is the Minister of Foreign Affairs. We spoke Friday morning for her first sit-down interview in her new role. Minister, thank you for making time.
No problem.
As we are speaking, Israel has attacked Iran, apparently targeting its nuclear program and top military leaders. Iran has launched drones in response, but we have yet to see the effect. Does Canada support or condemn Israel's move?
As Canada's foreign minister, my top concerns are first and always the protection of Canadians and their safety. And second, regional stability in a precarious time. We, as a country, always prefer negotiated solutions, and we encourage parties to get back to the table. The concerns relating to potential escalation are real, and the key is going to be to de-escalate and to reach a negotiated solution.
You say prefer negotiated solutions. Pierre Poilievre has put out a statement about this. He says Israel has the right to defend itself. It cannot wait until the regime has capabilities for a nuclear strike. Are you saying that that is the wrong approach to this?
Of course, Israel has the right to defend itself. At the same time, regional stability, which was already precarious, is foremost in our minds, and we need to ensure that there is de-escalation and that parties get back to the table. And that is really, from a Canadian standpoint, we are deeply concerned by the threat posed by Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program. We believe that Iran should not have nuclear weapons. But again, bringing it back to Canadians and Canadian interests, we are advising Canadians to exercise a very high degree of caution. We are monitoring developments very closely, and we are asking Canadians to follow the advice of local authorities.
You seem to be implicitly suggesting that you would prefer not to see this happening. Will you go so far as to say that Israel should not have done this?
As I just said, Israel has the right to defend itself. Canada as a country believes in de-escalation. And we also, at the same time, are concerned about the threat posed by Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program.
To that end, Donald Trump is pushing for Iran to make a deal at this moment. Will Canada and the other leaders at the G7, which will of course include the US president, support that push at this upcoming meeting? Will you try to make that deal happen?
So we believe that the best path to sustainable peace and security in the region are the talks between the United States and Iran. And we would like to see those talks continue going forward. And I, again, am going to come back to Canadian interests in regional stability and ensuring that we are doing whatever possible to support a negotiated solution. So yes, we are encouraging parties to get back to the table.
Further on the G7 meeting, let's talk about the decision to include India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The RCMP has accused agents of Modi's government in playing a role in widespread violence in Canada, including murder. The World Sikh Organization, Canada's Balpreet Singh, says inviting Modi to Canada feels like a betrayal. Take a listen.
The previous government took a stand that was principled, and it was direct. It was that you cannot do this on Canadian soil. When Prime Minister Carney was asked about it, he waffled. He said, well, that's a police investigation, and we have to think about supply chains. So for us, this felt like a betrayal.
What is your message to people who believe that their community is being targeted about why it is appropriate to invite Narendra Modi to this country?
So I want to take a step back and just say, as a matter of principle, the safety and security of all Canadians at home and abroad is my top priority. And as a lawyer coming into this role, I will unequivocally say that the rule of law should and will never be compromised in this country. The dialogue between the countries will include law enforcement, and our position in those conversations will rest on the necessity of observing the rule of law and the safety and security of Canadians, period.
But I want to be clear, the campaigns of pressure, of violence, there's no indication that they have stopped. He's being invited here while these campaigns that are linked to his government are ongoing. Is that not the case?
So the investigation that is occurring is at the RCMP level, which is separate and distinct from the Government of Canada. And so I want to say that when we reiterate the importance of the rule of law, we are also reiterating the importance of our institutions that support the rule of law. And those institutions include the RCMP. That is distinct from the Government of Canada, which is the host of the G7, where there is the necessity to have productive, frank, and difficult discussions. That's exactly what the Prime Minister will ensure occurs. Not every conversation is going to be easy at this conference. On the contrary, the discussions will be difficult, and our Prime Minister and I, as his foreign minister, will be at the table to have those conversations.
Let's talk about another conversation that is likely to happen at the meeting. This week, CBC and Radio Canada reported there is a working document on a potential deal with the United States. How close are we to reaching a deal with the Americans?
I want to say that these negotiations are extremely sensitive and extremely important. Obviously, given that our bilateral trade relationship is extensive and integrated. We are focused on building that bilateral relationship, but we're also focused on ensuring that tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, which have recently risen to 50%, must be removed. Tariffs on our auto sector must be removed. The work that is being done to ensure that Canada's interests are paramount in these negotiations is work that is sensitive and will not be work that I discuss here because of the need to ensure that Canadian interests are advanced at all times.
But I do want to understand something that you just raised, which is the existing tariffs. What makes you believe that Canada can get a deal to end tariffs when other countries are clearly prepared to just accept lower tariffs?
So I look at the history of the Canada-US relationship, Catherine, I look at the fact that in 2017, for example, we were able to effectively advance Canadian interests in CUSMA, a deal that President Trump himself signed. I look at the ability for Canada to advance our economic and security interests around the world effectively. Part of my role is going to involve strategic diplomacy with partners, not only the United States, but in Europe and beyond. And that will include deepening our economic relationships globally and effectively in service of the Canadian economy and in service of the protection and security of Canadians writ large.
Do you believe the defense spending that you announced this week, the speeding up of the 2%, is that going to help Canada get a deal with the United States or other allies?
So to be clear, the Prime Minister announced a $9.3 billion investment in Canada's defense, which means that we will achieve NATO's 2% target this year. And Catherine, we've had many conversations about the 2% in the past, and I will say this is good news for Canada, for Canadians, and especially for our Canadian armed forces. This is an investment in our armed forces. This is going to ensure that Canada is a strong, reliable, and international partner as a founding member of NATO at a time when we need to rebuild our forces and we need to look out for our ability to defend and protect our own country. So whether it's the economy, where we are advancing, and I particularly will be advancing our interests at home and abroad with existing partners and new partners, or whether it is on the protection and defense of our country and deepening our ties with our allies abroad, those are two objectives that are squarely within my portfolio, squarely within my gaze now, and I will be pursuing them relentlessly.
Okay. Minister Anand, thank you for this conversation at a very important time.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
You as well. Anita Anand is the Minister of Foreign Affairs. As Canada awaits Trump's arrival, not everyone will be anxious to greet him. Jason Stanley is a philosophy professor who left Yale University because of his concerns about Trump. He's an expert in fascist regimes and warns that the U.S. could be at risk of becoming a dictatorship. Stanley has now taken on a position here in Canada, starting next month at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. I spoke to him Thursday. Professor, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me on.
I want to start with this moment. Donald Trump deploying the Marines, the National Guard against protesters in LA. Also this large military parade that happens to be taking place on his birthday. How do you view this moment in U.S. history?
Well, I mean, what we have is Marines, that is the elite troops of the world's most powerful military, occupying a U.S. city to, quote unquote, guard against protests by civilians. So it's a very dramatic escalation. The president has promised to send National Guard into all cities that host protests against ICE. And then we have the situation where they're promising to deport 11 million people, which is essentially sending 11 million people into camps indefinitely along with their families.
California Governor Gavin Newsom has talked a bit about how he sees this moment. Let's listen to a bit of that.
California may be first, but it clearly will not end here. Other states are next. Democracy is next.
Newsom also talked to the New York Times this week talking about Trump's authoritarian tendencies. At the same time, Donald Trump was democratically elected. That was just months ago. So to what extent do you think it is fair to suggest that democracy itself is in jeopardy here?
I don't think the United States is a democracy. I think if Canada doesn't wake up to that fact, Canada will be in jeopardy.
You just had democratic elections, though.
So did Nazi Germany. And I mean, that's, sorry, with all due respect, but that's weird because Putin was democratically elected. Hitler was democratically elected. Now, how did Hitler take power? Through the Enabling Act. He declared an emergency after the Reichstag was burnt, and he seized total power. Trump is going to be using the Insurrection Act instead, but it's the same thing. He's constantly trying to create and indeed provoke an emergency. Now, whether we call the United States an autocracy or we talk about my colleague Lucan Wei's concept of competitive authoritarianism, where you have these elections, but they're not free or fair. The United States is no longer a democracy, and you're in peril if you don't realize that.
Are you suggesting that the last U.S. election in which Trump was elected was not free or fair?
No, it was free or fair. So was the election that got the Nazi Party elected into power. Democracy contains the seeds of its own destruction because you can vote an anti-democratic figure into power. This is in Plato's Republic. But my main concern is that other places in the world where there's democracy, it's very hard for you to put yourself in the mindset of a country that has lost its democracy. But that's essential right now in dealing with the United States.
These are such emotionally charged issues, but I do just want to spend a moment seeking a bit of clarity about what it is you're seeing here that creates such alarm. You make the comparison to Hitler, who obviously was responsible for the deaths of millions of people. There are certainly concerning things happening in the United States of America right now, but obviously on an intensely different scale. For you, it is specifically these emergencies that, as you just said, you view Trump as creating and provoking that are what turn around this idea that we are in the midst of an authoritarian moment in the United States?
Well, the comparison to Hitler was just not a comparison between Trump and Hitler, but just pointing out that many, many autocracies and fascist dictatorships started out with democratic elections. So that someone is democratically elected is neither here nor there. Trump promised, he's been very clear about his intentions. And so that really is
meaning what, sir?
He's been very clear that the unitary executive, he wants to he's clear that he's not going to leave power. If you think Trump is going to leave power of his own free will, I think that's somewhat delusional. He is not holding, the law seems to be no obstacle to his actions. So sending Marines into Los Angeles, this is totally illegal. Using the National Guard without the state approval, without any real reason is totally illegal. Doing what he's doing to our universities is totally illegal. The courts have stopped some of this, but it's such an avalanche that it's very hard to control. And this will only become more so, and I'm not seeing any breaks on Donald Trump's power.
Given what you have said, there is this big meeting, the G7, coming up this week in Kananaskis. How do you think Prime Minister Mark Carney and the other world leaders present there should treat Donald Trump?
That's sort of a question outside of my expertise. But, you should treat him like you treat any head of an autocratic regime. Saudi Arabia is a good example of, depends on whether you have your narrow interests as a country in mind, in which case you should flatter him and treat him like you would any king or dictator of a very, very powerful country. Or you want to send a signal, which could be dangerous. So I'm not really sure. I just think there are a lot of non-democratic there's a lot of authoritarian countries in the world. This is not new.
Earlier this week, Mark Carney made a speech in front of your new employer where you're starting next month. He was at the Monk School when the Prime Minister unveiled his plans to dramatically hike Canada's military spending. And he said in the speech that he gave there, middle powers risk being on the menu in the new world order. How much risk do you think this moment presents for Canada?
I'm not sure. You ask an excellent question. I think Canada just needs to think about its own interests right now and to preserve its democratic structure and its democracy. I'm worried about ideological creep coming into Canada. Authoritarianism can be a little bit like a virus here. It's going to be very important to keep Canadian values in the face of the kind of xenophobic, authoritarian ideology that is kind of taking over the United States, that is sort of taken over the United States right now. Obviously, Canada's military doesn't stand a chance, but generally the attitude of recognizing that you're a democracy next to a large country encountering a backslide into authoritarianism is vital, and behave accordingly.
You mentioned Canadian values, and I appreciate you're not here yet. You've made the decision to come, but I wonder what you perceive those values to be.
Equality. So not having the entire country being a kind of piggy bank for the top 1%. So, Canadian, universal health care, making sure that there's still something for people who are struggling, rather than the kind of dog-eat-dog capitalism that the United States has, where it's just really every person for themselves. Not having the country run by an oligarchy, and allowing full freedom of expression in universities, in the press, not targeting universities and the media for not hewing to state ideology. And finally, a country of diversity, where diversity is taken as a strength and not a threat.
You are part of a handful of professors who are leaving Yale to come to Canada. Do you think that Canada should be doing more to attract top American talent at this moment where people are losing jobs or feeling under attack from the Trump administration?
Right now, Canada has a unique opportunity to move its research structure into the top in the world. I mean, where are professors from the United States going to go? There is an enormous attack on our universities. Canada needs to scoop up the international students that no longer really have a home in the United States, whose trips through the border will be imperiled. Canada needs to scoop up the many, many top U.S. researchers who will want a home where they can speak English or French and not have to learn German or Italian or whatever other countries are going to be in this game. And it's really a unique opportunity to attract both students and researchers, and to make Canadian universities really the superior of other universities in North America.
Professor Stanley, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Professor Jason Stanley. His latest book is Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. So how do concerns around Trump's action and rhetoric affect the conversation when he comes to Canada? Do the other leaders need to say something?
Well, normally in the G7, leaders operate in the collective, so they're not going to focus in on either domestic politics or domestic events unless it has real implications for them.
Former diplomat, now Senator Peter Boehm has been a G7 Sherpa 6 times. Like the Sherpas on Mount Everest, they're the people who do the heavy lifting and find a path forward. But sometimes the G7 can go off course. That's what happened in 2018 in Charlevoix, Quebec, the last time Canada hosted.
He blasted the Canadian Prime Minister. This is the tweet, quote, "Justin Trudeau of Canada acted so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left saying that U.S. tariffs were kind of insulting and will not be pushed around. Very dishonest and weak. Our tariff."
On Sunday, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro stepped up the attack.
There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door.
Senator Boehm on what the atmosphere in the room was like before things went off the rails.
Mr. Trump was engaged in the summit discussions with the other leaders. He listened. He advanced. There are also bilateral meetings. I sat in the bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump, all very polite, all very correct. The reaction that came afterwards in tweet form, I thought was not measured. The Prime Minister gave a press conference in which he raised some of the issues that had been discussed in the bilateral meeting. Obviously, the President took umbrage at that, and his his advisors went even further in what I would consider a totally disrespectful and unprofessional manner. Now, the G7 is an informal international organization, but it's where leaders have that great opportunity to have a good exchange that is not scripted. And when you have events and discussions that are not scripted, then things can go in any number of directions. In the two summits, both in Taormina, Italy in 2017 and in Charleroi, I didn't see President Trump lose his temper, pound on the table, or do anything like that. So the action came in social media afterwards, and I think that is something that leaders just have to deal with and accept.
I want to talk a little bit about the guest list for this particular meeting. There are a lot of people who have ticked off Donald Trump coming to the G7 in Alberta. South Africa's Ramaphosa. Everyone, of course, remembers that blow-up with Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky.
With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful.
How much do you worry about a blow-up at this meeting just because of the personalities present?
Well, the meeting, first of all, is in camera, so there's no media. There's usually a camera spray at the beginning of the meetings, and it's between the leaders and with Sherpas present. So there is no need to have discussions like that, and if you do, they would be behind the scenes. When you have a situation, obviously the table at Kananaskis is not the Oval Office, and it is a discussion amongst peers that is guided by a chair who is the host leader. You will have a very different discussion than what was witnessed in the Oval Office.
Is it the chair's job? Is it Mark Carney's job here to some extent to avoid something like a blow-up between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky?
I suspect there will be a meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky that will be bilateral just between them and their delegations, but there will be a time when President Zelensky will be at the table with the other leaders. And in that context, yes, it is up to the chair, as a chair of any meeting, to keep the meeting on the rails, to ensure that all leaders who want to speak have a chance to speak, to sum up the discussion and to advance some points as well.
I want to ask you a bit more about the list, because the invitations to India's Narendra Modi, as well as Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman. Now, we should be clear, there are a lot of significant differences between the two men, but both have been connected to suggestions that their government was involved in assassinations. We think certainly of Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
Over the past number of weeks, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
And in the case of Saudi Arabia, Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was murdered, should those two leaders be welcome in this country? I know it's quite possible that the Crown Prince won't be coming, but should they be welcome here?
Well, when you have a meeting and you extend it, it is for reasons of the collective. So obviously there is a bilateral tension between India and Canada. Prime Minister Modi has been invited to the last 5 summits. He has attended. He is an important voice. And in following up on some of the themes, in particular the securing partnerships for the future in terms of the global economy, which the Prime Minister has selected, there's good reason for him to be there. Now, there's probably also good reason for the two leaders, the two prime ministers, to have a bilateral meeting. I don't know if they're going to have one, but this is an opportunity to sit down and say, okay, where do we go from here? We know where we stand on particular issues. Can we advance progress? So I see this as probably a necessary step, because otherwise you will just be looking at each other from a distance and communicating through the media.
In terms of what the whole meeting can accomplish, Canadian officials have said there won't be a joint communique. It means the leaders won't have one big statement on all that they have agreed on. Without that kind of agreement, how much can really get done at this meeting?
I think a lot can get done, and not having a joint communique, there are precedents for that. The last time in Kananaskis in 2002, there wasn't a communique. There was a chair's statement. The French, the year following us in 2019, also had a chair's statement. And you have to ask at some point, is it worth having a consensus-based communique when you can't necessarily get consensus, and then you boil down the language to the lowest common denominator and no one takes it seriously. So instead, look for individual declarations on the subjects that the Prime Minister has set out, whether it's the critical mineral supply chains, whether it's AI, where incidentally we had a framework statement negotiated at Charleroi for that as well, or on Ukraine, there's probably going to be a statement, and then a chair's summary saying we discussed these and these issues, we agreed to do this and that, and then you've got the success that you're looking for.
What does it tell you that there's so little these world leaders can agree on at this point?
I think there's probably a lot they can agree on, and if the communiques out of the finance ministers' meeting in Banff and the foreign ministers' meeting out of Charleroi are any indication, there's a good deal of common ground that leaders can pursue.
Okay. Thank you for this conversation, Senator.
My pleasure, Catherine. Thank you.
Senator Peter Boehm. Still to come on the House podcast, no more consumer carbon tax, turbocharged defense spending, a tough new border bill. Is Mark Carney a conservative? I'm Catherine Cullen. You're listening to The House, making politics make sense. Make sure to give us a follow so you never miss an episode. And tell us what you think of the show. You can email us at thehouse@cbc.ca. Just days before world leaders arrive for the G7 summit and shortly before a big NATO meeting in Brussels, Mark Carney has announced a dramatic increase to Canada's military spending. After years, decades even, of criticism from allies, Canada now aims to meet the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on the military, and will do it this fiscal year at a cost of an additional $9 billion. So, how will it shape our relationship with our allies? And can the Carney government actually pull it off? Erin O'Toole is a former leader of the Federal Conservatives. He's also a former military officer. Erin O'Toole, welcome back to the House.
Good to be back.
A piece of this is clearly about the message Canada is trying to send to its allies. You were just in the United States. How is the news of Canada reaching 2% of GDP this fiscal year going over?
It's going over well. You know, our allies have been calling on this for some time. And I was in Washington and people noticed. People took notice of not just the commitment on 2% and the speeding up of making it, but Prime Minister Carney's words as well, talking about the upheaval, the security situation around the world, changing alliances. People are taking note, and I think it's good because I remember when Barack Obama came to the House of Commons asking us to do this a decade ago. So I think it's the start of us really asserting ourselves in NATO and on the world stage at a time the world needs more Canada, as they say.
Indeed, that's exactly what the president said at that time. So there's enthusiasm about Canada doing this from some of our allies. But I guess one of the big questions is about Canada actually effectively spending its money on the military. We know in the past, money that's been earmarked doesn't all go out the door. Just this week, the Auditor General said the purchase of these new F-35 fighter jets is now expected to cost almost 50% more than the original estimate. With that in mind, how worried are you about not just the Canadian government's ability to spend this next $9 billion, but Mark Carney has made it clear he intends to go above and beyond. There are big pieces of equipment he wants to buy. How concerned are you about our ability as a country to do that?
I am concerned. We haven't shown the capacity in the past to do that, but the commitment politically is there. I used to battle with Stephen Fuhr in the House back in the day, but I want him to succeed because we need procurement to be accelerated. We need it to be successful. And I think there's a desire there. So in the short term, you know, the payments, the higher salaries for our men and women in uniform, better infrastructure on base, that stuff we know we can do. We know we can do quickly. But we do need submarines. We do need subsea cables and other surveillance equipment in the north, and probably some role in ballistic missile defense. So making sure that Canadian businesses and innovators benefit, particularly when some things will have to be bought from other NATO allies or the Rearm Europe program, where there's going to be sales and support back and forth. We need to improve our system to make sure that we spend the money that's committed. And I think all parties would support that, because our men and women deserve the tools they need to do the job for us.
And in that vein, concretely, I mean, if at the end of fiscal year, if Canada has spent that $9 billion, how big a difference do you see this making in terms of the armed forces?
I think it makes a big difference. There's serious recruiting challenges right now. There's generational changes in terms of how they view service, families and spouses and their careers being more important. So there has to be quality of life. There has to be pay that is recognition of the sacrifice and service that goes into wearing the uniform. So that needs to happen. There's going to be some changes to the Coast Guard. So there was a bit of, spending on the fly happening. I think that's good, but we will have to arm and train the Coast Guard a little different. But there seems to be a commitment. I think the Prime Minister has said what some of us have been saying for some time. The world has changed. We saw that when the full invasion of Ukraine happened. The war is still raging. There's tensions in the South China Sea. There's the Arctic as a domain where our sovereignty is being questioned by some countries. So we're playing a bit of catch up, but there seems to be a clear commitment, and that's good, because by the end of the month, the NATO target may not be 2% anymore, Catherine. It could be much larger.
One thing that I think is striking about this, Mark Carney is actually going further than Pierre Poilievre in terms of the speed and the amount of military spending. Mark Carney also canceled the consumer carbon tax. He introduced an income tax cut. He's out there talking about natural resources, the prospect of a new pipeline, perhaps. How much overlap do you think there is between the Conservative vision for the country and what Mark Carney is doing right now?
Well, there is some overlap, and I think you're seeing some praise for this initiative from myself, from Jason Stanley, other people, saying we need to do more. And there's a recognition going back 30 years that we haven't been consistent as a partner in NATO to the degree we wanted to. And look, Jason Stanley, Peter MacKay were great ministers of defense. So were Bill Graham, so were David Pratt. So in terms of the military and veterans, there's a lot of overlap between, business or blue liberals and conservatives. And I think there should almost be an all-party view that we need to give the equipment and the pay to the people that we asked to do a pretty incredible job for our country and to do that around the world. So I don't mind applauding a Liberal Prime Minister, because he's doing the right thing for Canada.
But some of the items on the list there go beyond military spending. I wonder, do you think in some respects Mark Carney is conservative or a conservative?
Well, I don't think he would say yes to that question, Catherine, but there are certain policies. Pierre had a very strong Arctic policy that was released just before the Liberals released a similarly strong policy. I used to say, when Romeo Dallaire and I would do veteran event on the Hill for mental health, some of these issues should almost be bipartisan between those two parties. But there are a lot of things, defense spending being one, the commitment to NATO and a strong principled foreign policy being another. There's aspects of what Prime Minister Carney's done so far that I think some Conservatives are very happy to see.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for making time, Erin O'Toole.
Thank you.
Erin O'Toole is a former leader of the Conservative Party. We want to keep exploring that last question with some of Ottawa's top political journalists. Is Prime Minister Mark Carney a conservative, or at least a small c conservative? And what does that say about how much our politics have changed in just a few short months? Here to discuss is Paul Wells, an author and podcaster here on the Hill, and Shannon Proudfoot with the Globe and Mail. Paul, Shannon, welcome back to the House.
Hi.
So, Paul, Erin O'Toole said there that there are aspects of what Carney has done that Conservatives are very happy to see. I mean, just how conservative is Mark Carney?
I think it's arguable that he's a conservative. I have heard that claim made by acquaintances of mine who are well to the Liberals' left and who are angry at him for he's not even the barely acceptable Liberal that Justin Trudeau was. He's now quite beyond the pale. And I've heard it from lifelong Conservatives. I know more than one person who just voted Liberal for the first time because they could make a kind of peace with themselves for voting for a Carney-led party. Of course, the reason it's an interesting question to bat around is that these labels are vague and can mean different things. Liberal used to mean a bunch of different things. Under Justin Trudeau, it meant a narrower range of things. Carney is not that different from John Manley or Lester Pearson, who were Liberals for their entire political careers. The Carney we're seeing today would have been very out of place in Justin Trudeau's caucus 3 years ago.
Ooh, interesting. What are you saying there, the Carney we're seeing today? What's the distinction you're making?
Carney is on the record having argued many times that the consumer carbon tax needed to be higher, and he got rid of it. He had a book that was supposed to come out in May about his idea of a future for Canada that I suspect we'll never see. And I suspect there would have been real cognitive dissonance between whatever is in that book and what we're seeing in Carney as a prime minister.
Yeah, it deals apparently with this idea of hinge moment, which is certainly one he's talking a lot about now, Shannon, but to what extent has that been reshaped? I think it's important to hear from the man himself on this because, in fact, Mark Carney was asked directly by a reporter whether he was a Conservative back in March. Let's listen to part of his answer.
The Conservative Party will say, well, they just cut taxes, cut regulation, everything will happen. 1,000 flowers will bloom. Well, okay, we know how that works. That is a fundamental difference, and it's a difference that's recognized, for example, by the mayor of Quebec, Quebec City, the mayor of Saskatoon, the mayor of Edmonton. I could go on. The mayor of Quebec, who, at least in my opinion, is an incredibly effective mayor, but is stupid, according to Monsieur Poilievre.
So, I mean, listen, part of that, I think, is partisanship. He's trying to define his opponent. But I wonder what it tells us about the extent to which Mark Carney, like why Mark Carney is a Liberal and not a Conservative.
He picked a very specific lane there, right? And of course, it's about taking a pot shot at Poilievre. But what he picked there was being a Conservative is about cutting. And then by the, I don't know, whatever's the reverse of the transitive property, that ain't me because that's not my plan. And he has taken pains to underline that. At the risk of regurgitating a politician's own self-branding, I do think there's a lot in the idea that he is, say it with me, a pragmatist, as he kept telling us during the campaign. I mean, we know in biographical terms, like 12 years ago, there was a serious effort to recruit him to run against Trudeau for the leadership. So at the time, he and people in the Liberal firmament considered him enough of a Liberal that they wanted him to make a go. It's also worth remembering that the Liberal Party under Trudeau, as Paul is saying, shifted way to the left and became a very different thing and arguably really narrowed what it was. In some ways, this is a throwback. You know, a few decades ago, we had more brokerage politics where, you know, the red team and the blue team would put together a package of offerings every election and you'd pick from them. That's why blue Liberals and red Tories existed. And then as things have polarized and bifurcated. But I think it's also this moment. It has been very politically advantageous to him, like to almost like a magic trick degree to kind of ride this middle rail. You know, he cut Poilievre off at the knees when he beat him to the punch on axing the tax. And there goes your most beloved slogan and kind of the core of your affordability message. He's talked over and over about responding to a crisis environment and we need to rehabilitate the Canadian economy on a big scale to respond to this. And he's chosen a very, very blue Liberal way to do that.
Do you think he is someone who could be at home in the Conservative Party?
Oh, that's an interesting question. My eyes are sliding in two different directions. I'm not suggesting he's a turncoat because I try to be careful. I would never make an assertion that would involve like peering into someone's heart and mind. This is a hedge, but it's the best I can do. He has a very distinctive way of being a Liberal and of leading a Liberal party. He is a guy, when you talk to people about him, he's got a ton of confidence in his own intellect. He's got maybe even a big ego, and he thinks he can do this. Like his answer about why all this is going to be okay is because I'm here and because I said so, and we're going to do this my way. And so I detect like a real strong streak of iconoclasm in him. And so maybe it's less like a partisan thing. I'm really aggressively riding a fence post here, but I just don't want to say he belongs on the other team. I think he is his own thing, like David S. Pumpkins on Saturday Night Live.
Paul, help us a little bit with the historical parallels here. I mean, you talked earlier about the idea that he doesn't represent the kind of Liberal Party that we have come to know under Justin Trudeau. Is there a moment to which Mark Carney's Liberals are more akin?
I mean, I think he would have been fine in Jean Chrétien's cabinet. And I know someone who works in a provincial government who ran into Chrétien in 2018, 2019 at a public event. And Chrétien was shooting the breeze with this person. And Chrétien said, "The only thing I know about politics is center. And from the context, it was clear that Chrétien was bugged by how he felt Justin Trudeau was leaving that crucial ground. And there's a phenomenon in our politics, basically since the end of Brian Mulroney's government, of increasing effective polarization between the political left and the political right in this country. A mutual disdain, staffers being told they can't go to bars that are frequented by staffers from the other parties and things like that. And I believe that all political careers come to grief, and I'm not making any claims that the Carney years are going to be fundamentally better or different. But he's gotten off that merry-go-round. He is not in the business of telling you that your kind of Canadian is the wrong kind of Canadian. And that's refreshing only in the context of the stupid, polarizing game that everyone else has been playing for the last decade.
I wonder, Shannon, also what this tells us about the public mood right now, right? Because we can talk about the politics of the leaders and what that tells us about where the center is. But what is it? There's a bit of a chicken and egg thing with the public mood as well.
And I think that's super relevant both with this guy and with this moment. I mean, the whole campaign was, first of all, where we are now versus where we thought we were going to be 6 months ago is super weird. But also the way it played out. I mean, remember when he first sort of emerged as a front runner for the leadership, people said, his French is weak. Like, that's going to be a huge problem. And then it wasn't, because we had this strange, pragmatic or expedient moment of panic where people just discarded a lot of things that are normally like sacred cows or deal breakers, and they just let them go. So there's this moment of sort of maximum flexibility, both, sort of ideologically and also like the projects people want to see done. I mean, that's becoming very mechanical as we look at this list of projects of national interest. Because when there's a crisis, people suddenly decide they need to be more flexible. And so I don't know how you disentangle the cause and effect there, but I think he is very shrewdly responding to that moment and kind of like pouring himself into the cracks between those bricks to respond to that public mood and that sense of the Overton window either shifting or expanding wide open.
So let's talk about where this leaves Pierre Poilievre, Paul. Public opinion polls showing that his popularity is declining. How much of a threat is it to him that Mark Carney is more, want to say centrist, want to say to the right? I suppose that's a relative, but the space, the political space Mark Carney is occupying.
I think Poilievre is in danger for his political career for a bunch of reasons and in a bunch of ways right now. Not necessarily insuperable danger, that you can make a good case for keeping him as Conservative leader. But part of it is that he was so obviously rising in our politics because he was a rebuttal to Trudeau. He was saying not that, but this. And it was interesting that in the last year he was talking a lot about common sense. I'm old enough to remember Mike Harris getting elected in 1995 on a common sense revolution. And that formulation has juice and works politically when common sense seems revolutionary, because the people who've been in power were not displaying much of it. Carney's he's a tougher nut for Poilievre to crack because he seems more often to be willing to listen to common sense. We have a lot of stuff that is in the ground in Western Canada that is legal and useful. Let's sell it. That's commonsensical. And Justin Trudeau found a lot of reasons to come up with a different answer and made himself quite an easy target for Poilievre. And Carney's slipperier.
Shannon, Pierre Poilievre has been very clear that he doesn't want to move to the center in the past, right? He has said that he sees other politicians doing that to try to curry favor, and then their policies wind up disappointing people. And so he really believes he has to sort of own the lane he's in. But when we look at the landscape, what Paul just described, what public opinion polls are saying, is there a case for him moving himself anywhere politically on the spectrum?
I think maybe the greatest danger Carney poses to him is that corrective function, like the sense that Poilievre was riding rocket fuel to the top of the polls because he wasn't Trudeau and he was the anti-Trudeau in so many ways. And Carney has kind of eaten that lunch out from under him. Like he is so different. I know there is still plenty of talk about is this really a new Liberal government? I think it's become increasingly clear that it is. There is a fundamentally different approach here. So it's that Poilievre loses that claim to common sense, to a new direction, to a sense of swinging the pendulum back to some sane middle. Like, it's very clear that in the country, there has been a sense of things going off the rails. I think it's been both tone, it's been vibe, it's been people being tired of being lectured, and it's a sense of, I can't afford a house or my groceries. Let's fix all this. So all of that added up to, let's bring things back to some, like Jean Chrétien said, center, center, center. And now Carney is all over that. And so I think Poilievre is going to be forced to alter in some way, because otherwise, what landscape is there left for him to own?
This was a fascinating discussion. Thank you both for being a part of it.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Shannon Proudfoot and Paul Wells. Okay, that is it for us this week. Our crew on the House is Kristen Everson, Benjamin Lopez-Steven, and Victoria Valito. Our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Thanks also to Miguel Plant for technical production. I'm Catherine Cullen. Thank you so much for listening.